have a dumb question for you.
Yeah.
It's been forever. So to present where you see the next slide in the corner, I guess is that presenter view?
Maybe one of, yeah.
Yeah, that
perfect.
works.
Okay.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, that should be.
Yeah. Have you ever met him, Dr. Ripple?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad here at wfc5, so I'm pretty familiar with most of the professors.
Yeah, gotcha.
Unfortunately, he was on sabbatical, so I still know of him.
Right.
Yeah, I think he's on to work with someone on the race project together, actually.
Yeah.
Just the fish stuff, not just the waterfowl stuff.
Right. This quarter.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. How about you?
Hopefully this quarter as well. We'll see.
Really?
I'm just doing a master's, so
Okay.
I'm trying to get
That's a
out
wise
here.
move. That's a wise move, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said you were working for USGS previously, and I just got it's a temporary position, but it's a field tech job, and I'm
cool.
really excited about it.
Nice.
And this is for Dixon office.
Yeah, with the feds, it's really important to get your foot in the door because they're so much more likely to hire you later on. Even if you've worked 6 months, it's like they're so lazy, the hiring process, so that's...
It really is. I feel like I'm being hired for the FBI or something. There's like fingerprints.
Yeah.
Background check.
For sure. It's worth it. I mean, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the job.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's only 3 months, but I'm excited about it. It'll be a good break from data work.
Right.
So drive ATVs around and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So this class, is this like a series of folks like me that come in and give presentations,
so
basically?
almost everyone is a guest lecturer. In fact, the actual instructor of this class, Rob Furrow, is not even teaching it this quarter. It's Rob. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Series of lectures.
Nice.
Last week it was Dr. Todd.
Okay, cool.
And then Dr. Levi Lewis was here this last week.
Yeah.
Stuff for last lecture.
Cool.
Which focuses on how fish use restored tidal wetland habitats in the San Francisco Bay Estuary. And prior to his grad work, Dave worked for several different agencies, including USGS, conducting fisheries monitoring research. So we're super excited to have him today, and please join me in welcoming.
All right, thank you. Just curious, show of hands. This is a WFCB class. Most of you guys are in that major, is that right? Raise your hand if you are. Okay. How about the rest of you? Filler class? Just a fun class? Cool. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about California coastal ecosystems and anadromous fish. Really big topic. I'm going to kind of focus on one system that is my study system as a graduate student. So, when most people think of coastal California, they probably think of something like this. Really beautiful, world-renowned beaches and coastline. But, it's also important to acknowledge coastal ecosystems in this country and around the world are really important for things like storm mitigation, recreational fishing, and things of that nature as well. Pretty staggering statistics here. You look at the bottom right there. Is there a pointer, by the way? Or no worries if not. No worries. So like 90% of the nation's harvest of fish they spend part of their life in coastal ecosystems and so on. Yeah, no worries. And then in California as well, there's a disproportionate number of people living in these coastal areas. So that's how much land areas made up of coastal California versus the number of people that live in those areas. And also, it's really important to our economy as well. And there's lots of different ecosystem types that could be considered coastal California. Today, like I mentioned, I'll be focusing on coastal wetlands, the sort of ecosystem I'm most familiar with and where my research takes place. And I should mention, if you guys have questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand or shout. It's much more engaging for me to sort of engage you guys in the process here. All right, just like there's lots of different coastal ecosystems, there's several different anadromous fish families. You guys know what anadromous means, I'm sure, for the most part. So a life history type that involves salmon is a good example. They're born in fresh water. They spend a few months or a couple years rearing and growing in fresh water and in estuaries, and then head out to the ocean to do most of their growth as an adult, come back again to lay eggs and so on. So several salmon or steelhead species in California. Today we'll focus on the Chinook salmon, which are currently threatened with extinction in the state. So coastal wetlands is a big, broad overview. Are these land areas, pretty simple definition really, land area that is periodically flooded by tides. And so they're in a tidal sort of region of the estuary. And as you can see here, this shows sort of a deeper subtidal channel. Subtidal meaning always flooded, and then some shallower intertidal channels, which are periodically exposed to air and then filled up again on a tidal basis, basically a 6-hour tidal basis. This makes them one of the most productive environments on Earth. They're shallow for one, which allows them to foster a lot of primary production, allows for light to penetrate through the water and stimulate production of phytoplankton, zooplankton, and then other secondary producers as well. And as I mentioned before, worldwide they support about 80% of fisheries. Typically it's a juvenile stage of these commercial fish that are found in these areas. And there's many ecosystem services. I mentioned reducing flooding earlier, improving water quality, storing carbon. I think wetlands store carbon, something like 10 times as effectively as forest. And so that's kind of a little known fact and one of the reasons why their conservation is so important, along with things like recreation and so on. But one of the kind of key features of these habitats, these coastal wetlands, and kind of a topic of my research is their reduced predation risk. And so you can kind of see here what looks like the anadromous life cycle you guys have probably seen before numerous times in grade school or in college or so on. That is true. That is the anadromous sort of life cycle. But I'll mention that other fishes also use estuarine areas, so the area between basically the ocean and riverine flow where there's a tidal influence. And so salmon are born up here, in the river, and they eventually make their way down, spend some time in the estuary and tidal wetlands, and eventually out to the ocean. But there's other species, that are born in the marine system and move in to use the estuary as refuge. And there's also lots of different variations of that. But across the board, the consistent kind of thread there is within the estuary, potentially reduced predation risk, which is a widely seen phenomenon throughout the world. All right, so I'm going to ask you in a second here, why is that? Why would there be reduced predation? But maybe this little time lapse will give you some insights into that. So as I mentioned before, intertidal channels. This is an intertidal channel that over the course of time dewaters and rewaters. So do you guys, anybody have any insights, any clues into why there might be reduced predation for small fishes in environments like this?
Large fishes wouldn't be able to survive in such shallow water.
Yep, great answer. So that is true, generally speaking. Larger fishes are typically not able to withstand the temperature and salinity fluctuations that occur in those shallow areas. Physically, they might not be able to access it for as long. They risk stranding, and also larger avian birds and stuff like that. They're pretty conspicuous to predators themselves in there. So great answer. And so this kind of schematic helps demonstrate that, I think. So this is basically a time series of depth. So you see this is flood tide when water's in the marsh, and then ebb tide when water moves out. Basically, this is an ebb tide, so the red sort of indicates insufficient depth, even for these salmon smolts. So they're sort of relegated to this deeper channel where they might experience some predation risk from these larger fishes. So periodically, they are exposed to predators, but a lot of the time they're able to access that shallow intertidal channel where they're not really exposed to larger fishes. And they're not as susceptible to avian predators as large fish might be. Occasionally there is some small predators in here, but by and large that sort of helps mitigate their risk. So it's sort of like a hide and seek function where they can, for a large portion of the day, reduce their predation risk in those environments. Plus, those tend to be shallow, warm, and productive areas where they can grow as well. And for these small fishes, their risk of predation is basically scaled with their body size. The larger they get, the more mobile they are, the more able they are to evade predators. All right, so unfortunately there's been widespread loss of habitat, coastal wetland habitat around the world, something like 50% around the world. And on the West Coast, we see 85 to 78 to like 97% here in our backyard in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Have you folks spent much time, know of the Delta? Have you talked about the Delta yet in this class or others? Not really, okay. Yeah, I feel like a lot of folks in this major in Davis aren't that aware, but it's a really important resource to California. So historically, it was one sort of vast tidal wetland network, lots of small dendritic channels, like I just mentioned. And over time, I think this is in the 1850s, this is present day, a lot of that has been disrupted for municipal water supply, agriculture, things like that. So typically these channels have been sort of combined into these large prismatic channels that don't serve as well for fish habitat. They're basically designed to convey water from the northern part of the state to the southern part of the state, and that water gets pumped down to LA and other areas to facilitate agriculture and human populations and so on. So with that means, historically these salmon smolts would use that area for refuge and for growth during their outmigration journey from fresh water through the estuary to the ocean. So as you can see here, this basically shows them sort of growing as they migrate, which leads to much better survival in the ocean and returns as adults. So we've reduced the amount of wetland habitat by 97%, a huge number, which has led to sort of compromised growth and survival during the emigration journey, which is really the most sensitive stage of their whole life history. If you don't survive beyond that phase, it's hard to maintain and grow a population. And as you might expect, there's been a pretty precipitous population decline, and they're sort of on the brink of extinction right now. I'm sure you guys are aware of this, but they have an immense cultural value in this state and country and around the world. They're distributed not just in the US, but in the North Pacific, lots of different areas. In this region, they were a staple food source for like 8 Native American tribes. I think around 10,000 individuals, which is one of the densest Native American tribes in the U.S. And they're a prominent feature in their trade economy and cultural environment. Still to this day, they're a good source of protein, income, connection with nature, and conservation. And just a few facts and figures here. This is 12 years ago. The commercial catch, I think, for the species overall was, 297,000 individuals, over $200 million in revenue, and then recreationally, 175,000 and over 100 million in revenue. So, they're important culturally, economically, sort of all the above. All right, any questions so far? All right. So, this decade has been designated by the United Nations as a decade of restoration, and that sort of arena restoration, not just in tidal wetlands, but in other ecosystems, is anticipated to become, really important within the conservation field. So those of you in WFCB or considering a career in conservation, fisheries, wildlife, or otherwise, that could be a really important avenue for your career and so on. So there's been a lot of investment in restoration, particularly within tidal wetlands for all the reasons I've mentioned, including 8,000 acres within our backyard here in the Delta, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is basically the upper San Francisco Bay Estuary. So that's one of the most ambitious restoration kind of initiatives worldwide, and we really need to understand how these restoration projects work. Like I said before, 97% of these are gone. So it's not as if we have a lot of sort of existing wetlands to emulate. So we're having to sort of reverse engineer the cookie recipe here to see what works and see what we can continue to kind of iterate and improve on from a design perspective. All right, so I'll switch to a couple of quick videos here so you guys can have a break from me, and then we'll come back to it. All right, so the video will talk about, restoration efforts in this region for salmon. So here we go. It's not showing up.
Salmon populations on the West Coast. So the problem that we see in a lot of our wild salmon populations on the West Coast is the loss of habitat due to human impacts. So things like building dams, channelizing rivers, developing agriculture, all these things have resulted in a loss of habitat.
A lot of people ask, what is the point of a lot of this restoration work? But when we look at it historically, we know what these fish need. We know what these fish actually kind of evolved with, and what they need are these wetland, kind of tidal wetland areas, these floodplains that connect the rivers to the land. A lot of the nutrients that kind of go into these salmon early in their life come from the land. And if we don't have that connection, there's an issue there.
So for example, here in the Central Valley, a lot of what was historically Delta floodplain habitat was converted over the last 100 years to land for agricultural use or residential use. And so that resulted in a channelized system where these fish are pushed through and they don't have access to this physical space that they would have typically had. If the fish are in a channelized system where it's nothing but riprap and rock, they're not having those opportunities to feed like they would in a restored area.
And so we know a lot of this restoration work is working through our monitoring and research, looking at, when we restore these sites, are these salmon actually moving into these areas? Like, yes, we can say that for sure. The second thing is, what are they actually getting from these lands when they're there? Our research has shown that connecting the rivers to the land makes those areas a lot more food rich for these salmon compared to the rivers that don't have that connection. We know these restoration sites are working because when we look at the growth of these salmon in restored areas versus unrestored areas, the salmon in the restored areas do a lot better.
Research guides us. It helps us determine, say, what level we want the property to be graded down to, so we can have passage of water overflow the land to bring nutrients into the system. Research guides us on what species are probably present in the area. Research helps us determine what constituents and ecology of the nature of the restoration we will need to provide for the species to stabilize or increase their populations.
Research is a critical part of our restoration efforts. So when we go out and restore these areas, we don't just look at it and say like, oh, this is restored, it looks nice. We actually go out and do a lot of monitoring efforts to see like what are our efforts actually producing. But research is a critical part. It's where we assess what we have done, and going forward, that information that we gather from each restoration effort as we go helps inform the next one and the next one. And with climate change, a lot of our research efforts help inform these restoration sites because we have to take into account sea level rise and other factors as well.
I see it as species survival. We're giving other animals a chance to compete in our world. So with the mass scale of restoration efforts, we should have improved water quality, air quality, habitat for species, outdoor opportunities for individuals. Having all those healthier aspects of a world will make it a healthy world for everybody.
All right, that's kind of an overview of the restoration enterprise within this region. This next video will kind of dive into a specific restoration site and kind of gain some more insights there.
I first came out here in 1998 and I was working to identify tidal marsh restoration opportunities. And when I walked along Lower Marsh Creek, it was obvious to me that this was a relatively easy opportunity to restore a large area of tidal marsh to benefit the fish and wildlife that historically have made their habitat in the delta.
The Dutch Slough project is about 1,200 acres, and it used to all be contiguous. It used to all be one piece of landmass, and it was all tidal marsh, where the tides come in and then the tides go out. So it was a wetland. The soil was completely saturated. It was completely covered with tules and other emergent plants. Really rich. It was creating a lot of food for fish and birds and other kinds of wildlife that used to live here when it was a marsh. We used to have here in the Delta about 360,000 acres of tidal marsh, and we've only got about somewhere between 2 and 5% of that left, because around the turn of the 20th century, throughout the Delta, humans came and started building all these levees and isolating thousands and thousands of acres that were really productive and putting nutrients out into the main channels. We isolated those. So it basically shut the grocery stores for most of the animals. I mean, there just wasn't that much for them to eat anymore because these tidal marshes are so productive for the base of the food chain.
Our early vision for Dutch Slough was a habitat restoration project, but as we started working with local people, we realized that what people wanted is they wanted open space and recreational opportunity, they want clean water, and they want public safety. We don't have to just restore habitat and set it aside for nature, which I really believe in, but we can do it in a way that provides lots of benefits to humans.
When we breach the levees, and then we have this natural change in hydrology every day with the tide coming in and the tide coming out, it's going to introduce a lot of native small little animals, the little single-celled animals that nobody ever sees. And then clams and all big insects and all kinds of things that live in the water will come in, and then they'll populate our Tule Marsh. And then the fish will also come in. So the fish will come in with the tides. We have a run of salmon here in Marsh Creek. So they go up Marsh Creek and they spawn, and then the little salmon come down Marsh Creek on their way out to the ocean. So we're going to route Marsh Creek through the middle of this parcel. So we will have these baby salmon coming in here, and hopefully they will see this as a really great neighborhood to sort of grow up in, because it's going to provide everything that they need. They need the same things that we humans need. They need enough food to eat, and they want a safe place to live and grow up to be big fish instead of being eaten by bigger fish.
The physical design of the Dutch Slough project is actually a controlled scientific experiment so that we can learn not only whether the project worked, but why it worked.
The Dutch Slough project was definitely designed to help us learn about restoration in the Delta. What's the best for fish? What's the best way to design the channels? What are the best elevations? Is it really as valuable to young fish as we hope that it will be? So we're going to study all of those things. And then all of that knowledge that we gain here will be used elsewhere for future restoration so that we can do better designs to get better ecological results. We call this a living laboratory because it's going to be a place for people to do experiments, and the knowledge that comes from that will help make future restoration projects more cost-effective and more ecologically valuable.
All right, before we move on, any questions from anybody? Have you guys seen material like this before in any of your classes? No? All right, who's not shy in here? Someone has to have a question, or I'll pick someone out. Anybody? How about one of you two, since you're up front? Oh, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this so far? I guess, have you talked about things like, predation and refuge habitat within any of your other classes as it relates to wildlife or fish and so on?
Not really, not yet.
Not really.
So for the predation of the small fish,
Mm-hmm.
and you said that avian predation isn't a big problem. Why
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't it be a big problem? Because don't a lot of larger egrets and herons not have a bunch of natural predators?
So you're asking about the predation of the birds on fish? Yeah, it's a good question. So it sort of varies. There's this idea that the larger the fish is, the more visible and more susceptible they would be to avian predation. I think there is a fair amount of predation on small fishes, but there's been tagging studies where they telemetry tag these fish and they look at their movements, and it seems to be that they prefer the shallow habitat where they might experience predation still from birds, but it's probably less than taking your chances with larger fish in the deeper channels. Good question. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Why do levees have such a big impact on this tidal habitat?
Yeah, good question. So, which way are we going here? Backwards? So, as you can see here, there was a lot of sort of smaller dendritic channels at one time, and basically those are combined to create more sort of efficient flow. So the idea is to make deep prismatic channels that flow faster, because the delta basically serves as a conduit. 2/3 of the water falls in the northern part of the state, and 2/3 of the demand is in the southern part of the state. And so the delta is designed to get water from point A to point B. And so, it's kind of antithetical to the shallow water refuge habitat that they reside in. It's sort of the opposite. These deeper riprap channels, they're deeper, they move faster, there's less shallow water habitat for refuge and also for foraging and so on. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Any other questions? All right. How many folks in here are like fish folks per se, or are interested in fisheries or have worked in fisheries and so on? Okay, a couple. Anybody curious about fisheries? Great. At the end, I'll have a couple slides. This region As you know, it supports a very large economy in California, which is, I think, the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. And so there's a lot of mitigation money available to help mitigate those impacts. So that means there's a lot of monitoring that goes on, lots of jobs, lots of entry-level jobs, just to kind of get yourself exposed, whether you're in fisheries or wildlife. Those entry-level jobs doing field work are pretty much synonymous. So, it's a good way to sort of get yourself oriented with what the field looks like, especially, the sooner you do that, if that's your plan, the better. Gives you some experience, and when you graduate, you can demonstrate that you've, done these sorts of things. All right, so they talked about the physical design there in the last video. And so what we do know is, typically we're excavating channels from areas that have been kind of diked and dredged, turned into agricultural areas for a long time, for the last 150 years. And so that involves moving a lot of dirt with heavy equipment, as shown there, and that's really expensive. And so oftentimes we don't necessarily know what sort of like quantifying fish habitat through each of these sort of hypothetical restoration designs, which is going to provide the most bang for the buck. We know that moving dirt is expensive. Is this one going to be that much better than this one in terms of the impact? So that's part of what some of my research does. So if you guys are familiar with the sort of PhD process, if you're working for someone in a lab and so on, they typically involve 3 chapters. And so overall, my research focuses on whether this reduced predation paradigm, which I sort of tried to lay out, whether that is indeed taking place here. That seems to be the case in many other regions in the world, but it hasn't necessarily been studied in this system. So one of those chapters involved deploying live hatchery smolts on these devices throughout a wetland complex, and evaluating the role of things like temperature and most importantly, water depth on predation risk. And so this fish is tethered. If and when a predator swims along and retrieves that and has a meal, the time is recorded. So we're able to determine maybe that happened an hour ago, and we can tie that to the tidal stage and the depth. So we know the depth at which that occurred. That'll provide insight into whether there's sort of a refuge range, like a Goldilocks range where there may be safe. So the field research I did supported that idea that there is indeed this, refuge provided by depth. And then I used that kind of depth range to categorize habitat into 4 different categories, which I'll get into later. But that's basically, the green here is that sort of Goldilocks range. And so you get to see across tides how that habitat shifts, and allow you to compare different kind of restoration alternatives to provide an apples to apples comparison of how much shallow habitat each provides. And then the 3rd chapter involved using these underwater acoustic cameras to monitor fish movement in real time, continuously for a period of about a month. Pair that up with depth and water temperature and other environmental covariates to determine the role of tides and time of day and things like that in driving fish movement. All of that, again, is used to inform how these different restoration designs might function as fish habitat. So I just want to give you a little kind of behind the scenes of what a graduate project can look like within kind of the larger framework, the larger sort of questions. So one kind of takeaway from this work, this is a little cartoon basically showing these fish, if they're moving, if they're always seeking this shallow water habitat, trying to avoid larger predators. So that's this depth range, 0.4 to 1.4 meters. So, by looking at how that habitat changes across time, you can get a sense of, time and space integrated habitat. So how many acre hours, area summed over time, of that green habitat exists in each one of these restoration designs. As I mentioned, moving dirt is really expensive, so this is an intentionally sculpted wetland, kind of like you saw using a traco and heavy equipment. This was once a levied, they call it an island. It was once agricultural island. Levees broke, and now it's sort of an unintentional restoration. It's shallow, but is that good? it's cheap, but does that translate into suitable sort of refuge and rearing habitat? So some broad takeaways. Integrated across space and time every 15 minutes for 2 months. So a really, sort of comprehensive view of this habitat. 39% of the time, it's shallow habitat versus, this habitat has 74% of the area is shallow water habitat. So if you use that alone, you're going to say, maybe this is a better habitat for these species. But we also considered, this is just a cartoon. This is not exactly accurate, but that's basically what we did is tracked how far those fish would have to move to follow that green sort of Goldilocks range. And so here, that's about 5 meters each tide they would have to move versus 28 meters. And that's a really important perspective given that we know, prey movement substantially, whether you're a deer in the woods or a fish in an intertidal channel, prey movement increases predation risk. You're just more visible to predators. And that also imposes a lot of energetic cost to move that much as well. So, this is kind of a couple metrics. We have about 6 metrics we use to compare across these habitats, and then in the future across a range of habitats to provide sort of a synthetic understanding of how design translates into habitat suitability. Questions on that? Did that make sense? Cool. All right, so basically this is a habitat suitability model, or the beginnings of one. It can also be useful, I think they mentioned in the video as well, sea level rise, which is happening, will continue to happen. As you can see here, say this is present day versus 10 or 20 years later, you can see that, that shallow habitat sort of shifts over time. And it's really important what the upland habitat looks like. If you have things like levees or other armored shorelines, your shallow water habitat sort of drowns over time, versus if you have this kind of sloped shoreline, that can continue to shift. This might still be shallow habitat, just like that was shallow habitat. So it's really important to kind of anticipate how, different management actions and or the landform is going to mediate. In some cases, it might produce more shallow water habitat. In other cases, it'll greatly reduce it. Something you guys may have heard of, or maybe not, shoreline armoring is a technique used to, kind of mitigate against sea level rise and shoreline erosion, things of that nature. So that's shown here, which again, that shallow water habitat kind of gets drowned over time and reduces a lot of those functions provided by this kind of sloping shoreline. This is kind of that same point is illustrated here. Again, that sort of drowns and exposes the smaller fishes to these larger predators, which doesn't happen nearly as much when the shoreline looks more like that, like a living shoreline. That's really important in California. Already, there's about 110 miles of shoreline that are armored, which is about 10% of California overall and about 1/3 of Southern California. And again, if I've made any points clear here, that will impact things like nursery function, not only in tidal wetlands, but across lots of different coastal wetland ecosystems, like the first slide I presented. So let's kind of zoom in. Red box there illustrates Bodega Harbor. So there's a marine lab out there. I don't know if you guys, has anyone been out there for a class or, okay. That's a really cool spot. They do a lot of research out there. There's a couple different marine protected areas outside of the harbor, and then the harbor itself. Often places like that are kind of overlooked in terms of conservation and fish habitat function. But as you can see here from this aerial photo, really shallow. And again, that might provide some of those functions we talked about. So I'll show a few slides here showing some fish classes out there. Folks did some sampling. You guys have probably heard of WFC 120. This is another class that takes place every couple of years. Involves basically during spring break, a week-long sort of experiential class where you design a research project and carry it out in a place like Bodega Bay, which we did a couple years ago. So just want to make you guys aware of those types of resources. So here's some beach seining from that area, where it's, I think, pretty self-explanatory. You drag this net along the bottom and catch things like invertebrates, lots of juvenile flatfish there, several different juvenile fish species, greenling, lingcod, and cabezon, I believe. So this kind of makes the point, this shallow, kind of sloping shoreline provides habitat for a lot of these. In some cases, these will grow up and be large predators, but they still use that themselves as predation refuge as juveniles. So anyway, if you're into fisheries, I would encourage you to kind of look into these classes and, and/or, opportunities. There's lots of labs on campus that do research as well. And so, overall, we talked today about kind of nursery function, whether you are, Bodega Bay, some other coastal area, the San Francisco Bay Estuary. These shallow habitats provide a lot of, rich foraging areas, and as you can see there, no predators in that particular picture, but they're probably lurking out in here, potentially waiting for dewatering and foraging opportunities themselves. But again, really important, not only in this region, but around the world. So with that, it's unlikely we're going to return the San Francisco Bay Estuary to this kind of, this 1800 status. But I think we can provide some of those same functions, and research is, needed to not only know shallow habitat is good, that's kind of very broad. We need more specific insights into, channel configuration, depth gradients, those types of things to restore some of those same functions. So with that, any questions? Yeah.
With restoration augmentation, you're saying that you want it because of the cost limits, you want to effectively limit yourself to digging out channels that will be utilized by fish?
Yeah, good question. So, there's always the kind of efficiency consideration, right? If there's only so much money, we need to spend it in an efficient way to produce as much good habitat as possible. So one of the first things you would do is kind of look at relic habitat and produce something similar as a baseline, right? If there's an existing habitat, use that as your baseline and then do several different iterations of that. And then use things like modeling to help provide insight into which might have the most shallow habitat, the least migration distance, and things like that. And then, cost is a consideration. So if you can do it for less money and generate more habitat, that's a net win. Does that answer your question?
So, might there be like other ecological benefits to shallow areas that fish may not utilize it often that you might miss with just looking at fish?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should have mentioned that restoration, fish considerations, fish habitat is just one of many considerations, including garter snakes and, saltwater harvest mouse and other species as well. This is just one kind of decision support tool. We know these are really important functions, and if we can quantify that and then look at that alongside all the other information we have to sort of help guide our decisions. Certainly, it doesn't capture everything, but I think we try to capture some essential functions, such as the amount and the availability and the accessibility of habitat, as a heuristic. We can't look at everything everywhere all the time, but that can provide some insights that allow us to kind of make decisions. Does that help? Yeah.
Will there be a difference? So you said restoration projects, like, they focus on more shallow water and less movement. Will there be like a difference in like population levels from flooded islands and restoration projects, since
Yeah, you know, translating kind of what we talked about here to like population level impacts is pretty difficult. I think we're in the early stages of that, but you know, say we can, you know, there's lots of existing surveys already. So if we were able to generate this information across, say, 10 wetlands that are monitored presently, we would be able to discern sort of correlations between maybe these metrics and how well they're performing in terms of fish diversity and things like that. Typically, you're looking at elements of like diversity index and things like that, because sampling is difficult. You're never, you know, censusing the population. We're never getting, you know, all the information, but we can use these types of metrics to see if there are associations between fish diversity and abundance and habitat configuration and so on.
So are these restoration projects like they kind of designed to help smaller fish like juvenile salmon, or is it kind of just more in general just fish?
Yeah, yeah. There are two primary focuses in the delta and then the estuary. Is production of food. Those same attributes that provide refuge are thought to provide more primary production, right? And then the juvenile life history stage is one of the most critical for the fishes of interest within the delta. And as I mentioned, around the world, these areas are really important for that early life history. So yes, it's intended to benefit juvenile fishes. Yeah. All right, so a couple slides here on, this is a paper, if anyone's interested, just came out a couple months ago. It talks about kind of the status of tidal wetland restoration efforts in the San Francisco Bay Estuary, kind of like where we're at right now, what science needs there are, and so on. And then, as I mentioned, you know, this is the estuary, and this is kind of a heat map of different monitoring surveys that take place within this region, and all the different agencies and kind of surveys and so on. So for you guys, that means lots of jobs, lots of entry-level jobs, if that so interests you. And a couple resources on, I believe, Instagram or something, showing kind of like behind the scenes what happens out on these surveys at times, although maybe rare. They're catching really large sturgeon, things like rays and so on. And also, this is a resource online. It's kind of a blog type thing. It talks about a lot of this stuff. So again, if you're interested in this, you know, it's another resource to kind of get familiar that might help you in a job interview and pursue a career like this if that's of interest. Similarly, the San Francisco Estuary is another kind of magazine type thing. That kind of, you know, research articles and peer-reviewed articles take forever and a day to come out. But these provide some kind of insights, more informal insights into projects that are taking place in the region. Same here. And then, is anybody familiar with what Fisheries Observer jobs are? No one? All right, so for folks that are like interested in kind of marine systems more generally, there's these jobs that exist that basically, you know, you are providing insight into NOAA, or for NOAA, into catches of commercial fleets. So for example, I did this up in Alaska eons ago, where I was on a couple different groundfish boats, fishing for cod and other species, taking, you know, samples and providing that information to NOAA that they use to kind of manage the fishery. So again, a good entry-level position if you are, you know, brave enough to go out in the ocean and do some of this work. And if you take, you know, the fish class on campus, it teaches you a lot of these skills, fish identification and so on, that can be useful in a job like this. All right, and I guess that's it. So yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Do you know if there's a difference in cost and like upkeep between the two strategies of like just like breaking down a levee or like creating?
Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think